Well, good afternoon. And that was an interesting intro. We wanted you to hear that music a lot. Anyhow, my name's Adrian, and I'm in studio with one of our pastors here at Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, Sean Richards.
Hello.
That guy, not this guy, but that guy. Happy to be here, and this, of course, is one of my favorite days of the week because it's Apologetics Monday. And today we'll be covering a very interesting topic, very difficult to delve into, and, of course, very critical because probably one of the most influential spiritualities apart from the Abrahamic faiths. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be covering something very interesting today. But before we do that, just to let you know, this is A Reason for Hope. This is a weekday Bible answer program where we take questions from our live stream audience about the Christian faith. So if you have a question about how to apply a specific scripture to your life or whether or not there are reasons to believe Christianity is true, what about the resurrection or God's existence, or can I trust the Bible? Those and many more we've covered for many, many years, and so you can go to our various social media platforms and check out what we've discussed in the past. But if you have a question fresh in your mind and you would like to ask, feel free to take the time to join our program. This is an off-the-cuff sort of impromptu Q&A show, except for Mondays. Mondays we actually delve in deep into a specific topic. But if you want to engage with us even on Mondays, as long as the topic of your question pertains to today's subject matter, then feel free to ask away. And today I think because it's such a broad subject, many of your questions may apply, especially if you're a skeptic or someone who's sort of seeking spirituality but not sure which direction to go in. Feel free to join us. There are multiple ways you can ask your questions. You can join us, of course, on the usual social media platforms like YouTube. You just go to A Reason for Hope, our direct link, I should say, youtube.com/@A-Reason4Hope. You can also catch us on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/CCF Tucson, or just look for Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson. You'll find our Facebook page, and we would encourage you to like, subscribe, share, all those things to help get the word out, because we really want to give people a reason for hope. We do this every weekday, Monday through Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. Arizona or Mountain Standard Time. You can also join us on the X platform. Follow our senior pastor, Scott Richards, on Twitter, and if you follow him, you'll see when we go live. And if you join the live stream, there is a comment box where you can ask questions. If that's not working for you, if we're not catching it, especially if you're on an Android device, it's still buggy, you can just DM or tweet out a question, and we'll get it that way. You can also join us on our website if you want to avoid social media altogether. Just go to calvarychristianfellowship.com, hit the Watch Live tab. Not only is there a comment box, but there's a little prayer button too. So if you have something weighing heavy on your heart in your life, send it along and we'll get it to our prayer team and we'll pray for you. That's why we're here. Last but not least, if you want to avoid social media and you want to maybe be discreet, or perhaps you're thinking of a question and you don't want to forget it, you want to just get it out, you can just email us at any time. And that email address is questions@areasonforhope.org. That's questions@areason4hope.org. Before we get to today's subject, we'll take a moment to pray, and then we'll get started.
Sounds good. Dad, thank you for the honor you've given us to share your word, be among your people, and even to engage with those that are settling for less than you. I want to ask for a spirit of compassion as well as joy, not only in all that we have, but also out of a desire for those to come to know you as you've revealed yourself. And while these certainly are confusing topics and a lot of history behind them, we ask that just like you are a God who calls himself the truth, that we would have a love for the truth that would seek to know even worldviews contrary to our own. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
It's true.
Well, today we're covering the great, large subject of Hinduism.
Oof.
You might be thinking, well, why would we do that? Hinduism has probably been, along with Buddhism and Eastern thinking, has been probably one of the most influential faiths, I guess you could say, as far as the West is concerned, because, we've always been sort of founded on the Judeo-Christian idea, and so anything new is appealing to people because it's different. We have a rebellious nature, and whatever the status quo is, we want to go the opposite direction, and it becomes very appealing. So share with us a little bit of background and And why would this be considered an apologetic?
Yeah, obviously, as we just said, the concept of Eastern philosophy, Hinduism specifically, going back 3,500 years, not because of writings per se, but definitely because of archaeology, are very prevalent in our culture today because, as you said, we're looking for alternatives to Christianity that would include the benefits but without any of the moral obligations, which, again, Hinduism has a different lens towards, but we'll get more in that in a second. Because, again, we take for granted what Judeo-Christian ethics have done in our culture and society. I don't know why the Euphrates River would be that dividing line between the East and the West, but it seems that once you cross that border, there's this aura of mystery and foreignness. And even when it comes to, certainly not the only, but definitely the most prevalent and popular, music groups like the Beatles or cult groups that were prevalent in the United States during the hippie generation come with this aura of Eastern thought. We think that, well, it's going to offer everything that Christianity has and then some, when in reality, despite the fact a lot of people willing to sign up, they discovered very quickly that Christianity and Hinduism both address the same topics. They are religions for all intents and purposes, but the answers and conclusions to both of those questions are going to be completely different. And this will go along with the same mistake that people make when they try to claim that all religions teach the same thing. It either has to misrepresent one or both, and do so in as unclear an image as possible in order to point neither religion to people in a way that actually shows respect for them. So as, again, we stated before, we love the truth, and we don't want to even be critical of a religious worldview when it's not actually what it's claiming. And while Hinduism certainly has a lot of history, it also has a lot of variety, and it is also very fluid, whereas Christianity is very concrete and rigid in what it's trying to claim and what it isn't. But our goal for the next hour or so is to lay out what are the most prevalent and substantive claims within this philosophy, and hopefully with the religious aspects in mind, we'll be able to recognize the difference between not just the worldview as a whole and the consequences of that, but how it ultimately ends up presenting itself as Christianity, and being able to say where and when, no, that's very, very different. And this will, again, be in terms of things you've probably heard before. We actually got messages of it at the time of this recording this morning. They will say things like, well, reincarnation's in the Bible, or karma will sort everything out and treat it as if that's a system of divine justice. They'll even say Jesus was a guru or an avatar, or maybe, if you're an atheist, and we'll see if we have time for this, say that Krishna was actually what Jesus was based on historically. All these things are ultimately going to be addressed, and we want to make sure that you're equipped for that and prepared to be able to say, no, I don't remember everything that guy with the weird haircut said, but I think I ought to look this up, and at least be able to enable you and give you that moment of pause rather than getting caught up in a lie. The things that we're going to cover are, again, the main worldview of Hinduism and what its moral structure is all based upon, regardless of the sect that you belong to. The second will be concepts of Hinduism to be familiar with, things like karma, Atman, and especially reincarnation. And then the common confusions that are made with Hinduism. Again, there are more, but we'll mainly focus on things like divine judgment as opposed to karma, the resurrection as opposed to reincarnation, redemption as opposed to just working out your karma, and then, of course, the difference between heaven and Brahman. And again, if we have time, we'll discuss some of the more common objections you'll hear from those with a Hindu worldview, even if they don't necessarily call themselves as such. The word just literally means someone from on the other side of the river. So starting with the main topic, the worldview of Hinduism and how it's going to ultimately see the world through a lens that Christians don't have. When they look at the world, they're obviously seeing the same matter, the same colors, the same smells, and et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes down to it, how they are looking at it, the angle by which they're looking at it, isn't looking for beauty, isn't looking for God, isn't looking for, say, for example, atheistic claims like things more fit to survive, or even things that make us feel good, despite what many Eastern religions would try to claim. the worldview of Hinduism is all centered around one thing and one thing only, and that is attachment. That the one thing that their moral system is based on, if you're good or bad, it's going to be because of or the lack of attachment, not feelings, again, not because of outcomes, not even because of survival. What makes something good from a Hindu worldview is in reference to what they would determine as righteous or wicked, attached versus indifferent. And I'm not going to, of course, just say this lightly when we see the consequences of those actions, which we'll discuss more in a moment in regards to karma. It's determined as good or bad because of this. And we can read this in the Bhagavad Gita. Now, the Bhagavad Gita, for those of you who definitely aren't familiar, is probably the most comprehensive Hindu source as far as someone who's reading to learn what Hinduism actually claims. And while it isn't, again, the only source, and maybe not even the most exhaustive source as far as volumes are concerned, it is one of the more comprehensively preserved writings of Hinduism and one of the more ancient. So if you want to get back to the earliest concepts of what Hinduism actually claimed, especially before the time of Christ, this would be it, because the other documents date centuries after the time of Christ, and most specifically were the only ones compiled or preserved because the Muslims burned them all when they took over India in the 8th century. So starting in the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, in verse 34, in a conversation or series of conversations that a prince by the name of Arunja was having with Krishna, one of the avatars of Vishnu. We'll go more into that in a second. For all intents and purposes, just he's talking to a Hindu god. And he doesn't know it, but he's sharing his wisdom. He said the following in 334. The senses naturally experience attachment and aversion to the sense objects, but do not be controlled by them, for they are waylayers and foes. So notice, attachment and aversion to the sense object. They are the waylayers. They are the foes. And this is further detailed in chapter 2 and verse 50. One who prudently practices the science of work without attachment can get rid of both good and bad reactions in this life itself. Therefore, strive for, and they just stick to the word, yog, which is the art of working skillfully or in the proper consciousness. Now, you see these kind of perspectives somewhat overlaid into Buddhism, and we'll have a whole separate message for that. But in regards to the kind of attitude or perspective that a good Hindu boy and girl is going to have towards life, their entire worldview is centered, chapter and verse, around this concept. That it's not what you do, it's why you do it. Now, we would say as Christians, well, that kind of sounds familiar, whatever you do in word or deed, do all for the glory of God, right? Well, no, because what glorifies God? What reflects his character, right? His nature, his attributes. And as we're going to be getting into, he's all sort of attached to us. And he's also sort of attached to his glory. He's also sort of attached to the truth. He's also sort of attached to life and the abundance thereof. But for Hinduism, understand that attachment is the worldview that sees these things as evil. And that out of attachment, total indifference or neutrality, that is what they would deem as good. That's why you see the most sincere Hindus not going out and performing good deeds like feeding the poor and stuff. The slums of Calcutta are there for a reason. They are left alone and isolated because their society's indifference towards them is Hinduism personified. Where are the priests? Where are the devout followers of Hinduism? They're up in the mountains. They're up in villages and caves and meditating, indifferent to the world around them. Why? Because that's what Hinduism is. It's a worldview that looks at the problem of evil, just like Buddhism, just like Islam, just like any other, but says, how do we deal with this problem? Is it our fault, as Christianity would say, and that our redemption to God fixes the issue? Is it our laws, like Islam would teach, and that if we obeyed Sharia and followed modeled our lives around the Prophet, that would suddenly solve all our problems? Hinduism is, your problem is that you care. And if you stopped caring, the problem goes away in reference to you.
Yeah, and one of the reasons for that indifference is because within the worldview of Hinduism, evil is an illusion. Morality is an illusion.
Life is an illusion.
Because it's not a monolithic religion. So even if you have a Hindu reading this passage and thinking along these lines, you'll find a few million Hindus that don't even understand what you just said.
Yeah, and they don't have to.
And they don't have to. It doesn't matter. And another reason, well, we'll get into the karma system in a moment, but yeah, and the caste system.
Yeah, and more the former than the latter, because when people get into issues about the caste system, like you mentioned, Adrian, Hinduism is incredibly fluid, incredibly open, incredibly inconstant as far as what it's actually trying to claim, which is why sifting through all this stuff, and first of all, please don't get me started as far as the migraines that I endured trying to read through these sources, because they have no set standard as far as what ought to be known. They just think and talk for its own sake. They don't have any attachment to these ideas or concepts, which is, again, why you see that this is the real issue here. The lens that they're approaching through life doesn't care about, and this needs to be understood properly, truth even. Because the idea of truth is an attachment to this reality when we should be focused on the greater whole, whatever that means. I'm not attached to the conclusion. You see the problem with this. So with a total lack of commitment and a total lack of investment, we're noting that this existence, this life, this conscious will is either going to be centered around your place in it or the next life, whatever that would constitute as living, or maybe a conscious will. There's certain Hindu sects that would be more interested not just in the future, but in iterating yourself back to the past and reflecting on the nature of the lessons you've learned in previous lives because of something we'll talk about in a second, your Atman. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, the reason why Hinduism is so hard to talk about in an informed setting and why we don't see a lot of Christians engaging with it is because, and I mean this with full respect, at the end of the day, compared to what Christianity puts forward as its belief system, it's incoherent. It has no commitment to what it actually is trying to communicate, because that in of itself would be attachment. So when we see the consequences even of this philosophy, we would naturally say that neglect, for instance, is just as, if not comparatively bad, when it comes to those who are committing the acts themselves. If someone's negligence resulted in the death of somebody, a Hindu would look at that and say they were so unattached, just allowed the universe to run its course. That's a wonderful thing. Whereas in the West, we would look at that and say, you ought to have intervened because the preservation of life is something worthy of being, catch this, attached to. But with that then in mind, you see even Christian philosophers who were able to understand the consequences of this kind of thinking. C.S. Lewis, in his letters and essays that ultimately were compiled into Mere Christianity, made the observation that when we choose to love, we choose to hurt. Because to be committed to or attached to anything inevitably puts yourself in harm's way. When you're in the hands of a fallen, sinful human being, it won't be handled properly, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. But he said, what's the alternative? The alternative is to not commit to anything, not a hobby, not a pet, not a family member or friend, not a spouse, nothing. The safest place from harm, from hurt, is to encase yourself in this vacuous hole that we would call hell, where you are, of course, devoid from the risks that are included in love and attachment. That's heaven to Hinduism. That's righteousness to Hinduism. And this is what needs to be understood, because when we're engaging with people and we confuse their indifference towards either hatred or even deception, it's not their fault. They're living out a worldview, a lens, centered around this idea of attachment, and that's the consequences of it. So when we're talking to or about Hinduism, we need to be aware of these two principles, and I'll read them again. In the Bhagavad Gita, according to Lord Krishna himself, we note that these waylayers and foes are centered around attachment or aversion to them, and that in explicit detail, chapter 2 and verse 50 says, one who prudently practices the science of work without attachments can get rid of both good and bad reactions in this life itself. Yog, the art of working skillfully, is just that. So understand that's the Hindu worldview. Now, the concepts that we need to be aware of, and moving on from this point, are, again, as far as what's relevant to Christianity, there are a lot of terms in Hinduism that if you're engaging with them ought to be familiar with, but the sort of things that are going to creep their way into Christian terms and may end up being confused one to the other are going to, of course, be, as we talk about in logic, equivocation, using the same word but meaning the opposite and trying to pull a sneaky thing in that way. These words are something that every Christian needs to be familiar with on Hindu terms as opposed to Christian terms, because without that we end up not just deceiving ourselves, but we'll end up adopting a worldview the Bible isn't justifying. So starting with the most common, I'm sure that you're all familiar with. We see it on T-shirts, we hear it in TV shows, this whole commonplace argument of, I'll just leave it up to karma. I want good karma as opposed to bad karma. Well, I don't want to do that because I'm worried it may come back on me. These sort of ideas that would involve themselves in witchcraft, that would involve themselves in neo-paganism, Norse paganism, Egyptian mythology, and plenty of others. This idea of cause and effect, these exchanges in a moral sense, are even ones that unfortunately Christians think are what are being talked about when we say that, well, God will judge them someday. And we think that that's what is meant when we say karma. But the reality is that karma actually means something. And the word itself, karma, means to act or to do, both in physical and in your will or consciousness. In a Hindu worldview, the idea that, again, all actions have consequence in terms of the universe is, I think, fairly straightforward. You know, Newtonian physics, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. However, once again, these aren't because they're moral or immoral, good or bad. It's because anything good or evil is not the universe, is not Brahman, is not the way things not just are, but is. Because in the deification of creation, of the universe, we find ourselves in a position where we end up, I guess, confusing fundamental beliefs. We're all supposed to be, in the Hindu worldview, the non-existent, the entity that encompasses all. And again, there are different Hindu sects that will define things very differently in these ways. But as far as what motivates them, that's what's going to be key. And as we just finished discussing, it's centered around attachment. When good or evil is done, it offsets nature and the nature of the universe. And that is what ultimately changes things. So if you do good, evil ends up happening somewhere else. And if you do evil, good is caused somewhere else. But both are wrong because they're instigating this cycle of attachment and as a result of suffering. And of course, they are both evil as a result because of your actions, your karma, and are making yourself more and more attached to this existence rather than the inexistence of the state known as Brahman. So understand, when people are saying, I want to do good things so that more good things happen to me, they've got the concept of karma completely on its head because they're reading it from a Judeo-Christian worldview that not good or evil is the focus and emphasis, but attachment is the focus and emphasis. To act, yod, as Krishna said, apart from any form of attachment is yod, is the good. But when actions are committed with good or bad motivations of attachments, I want to do something good to a Hindu worldview, that's bad karma because it's offsetting, it's perpetuating this attachment to the now, to the it, to the are, rather than the is. And again, there are other Hindu philosophies that will approach it in the same way. But this is a universal principle that every Christian ought to read more into and go to the Hindu sources themselves, not the non-explanations that are given by public college universities and so forth, regarding what this is actually talking about. Karma, the actions, are from this worldview of attachment. What makes them good or bad is whether or not you care. And that's the issue. Another issue that oftentimes gets confused with Christian morality is the idea of Atman. Now, Atman is what's, in its simplest term, your enduring self, or your person, if you want to use a more accessible English word. The Hindu term of the living nature of Brahman in all things, whether it's, again, living or not, is, I think, explained most coherently, and I say that squinting very, very passionately, and I'm going to mispronounce this, but I'll still put it out there, the Chandogya Upanishad. Take your pick as far as how that properly translates, but this is book 6 and chapter 12. It notes a conversation between a father and his son. I can't pronounce their names either, so I'll just say father and son. The father said, "Bring me a fruit from this banyan tree." The son replied, "I have brought it, sir." Father said, "Break it." The son, "I have broken it, sir." The father says, "What do you see inside?" The son says, "There are tiny seeds, sir." Father says, "Break one of them, my son." The son says, "Sir, I have broken it." He asks, "What do you see?" "Nothing, sir." Then he says to his son, "The finest part in that seed is not visible to you, but in that finest part lies the huge banyan tree. Have faith when I say, O son, that which is the subtlest of all self is in all this." And that's the word, Atman. "This is the truth. It is the self, Atman. That thou art, O son." And then the son said, "Sir, please explain to me again." He says, "I will explain it again. I won't." But the idea is just that, the invisible essence, the entity that is you and I, is as much found in the seed of a banyan tree as it would be in you and me. Now, that's oftentimes confused with the concept of a soul or a consciousness. But the reality is that, and say, for example, in terms of practicality, why Burger King isn't doing so well in Hindu circles is because they recognize this, and it's not true from the Christian worldview, but this is the belief, that when that Atman, that essence and living nature, is found in, say, for example, cows, or pigs, or livestock, they commit to vegetarianism, if not outright veganism, because those conscious beings may in fact also be the consciousness of an honored ancestor, or a royalty, or royal figure, or anything else like that. Now you say, oh, that's a high respect and regard for life. Not when it's causing children to starve.
Yeah, they have such a aversion to exterminating rodents that their crops are just demolished by the rodent population. They would have enough food to feed almost the entire planet if they didn't hold to these views.
Ideas have consequences. You even see families where they are carefully taking fleas off of their children and placing them down with respect. You say, oh, well, that's maybe PETA-ish, but what's the issue with that? Those flies are carrying diseases. And instead of swatting them and preventing their children from getting infected by mosquitoes and other pests, they have to handle these things in light of this worldview out of an avoidance of causing any harm to them with the same regard and dignity that you would have for a human being, and ending up dismissing both of their value fundamentally. Because when it comes down to it, Adrian is the father in the room, the life of your child is in fact more valuable than the life of the flea, in a fallen world especially. But notice that the worldviews here have consequences. The values are causing people not just to suffer and starve, but to do so thinking that they are being respectful. That's a problem, because if they're correct, we need very good reason to understand this is the way that things are and have to be and should stop caring tomorrow. But the problem is we do actually care, and there's a reason for it, and I have more justification for that worldview, a la the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, done out of attachment, by the way, than I would the claims of the Hindu Brahmin castes. And again, it's going to vary from various Hindu sects, and there are Hindu sects that are a bit more practical, but that's because of the influence of Christianity, not Hindu tradition. The point being made, though, is this. That poem causes suffering of untold millions.
Billions.
Yeah, throughout history for sure. Yeah. But noting the population of India is the most prominent Hindu place on the earth, and you could note areas in Japan and China as well. The reason they perpetuate this cycle of suffering and negligence is because of this worldview, this belief of the Atman, the enduring self, being present not just within human beings, but noting that unlike the image of God, animals, rocks, pests, soil, oxygen molecules, and this will be important when we get into reincarnation in a second, all of these things are regarded as just equal in value, when in fact there should be a hierarchy, but the hierarchy is determined by whom? The priests that believe that no attachment, no care or concern for the suffering of these people is what's kept in mind. Ideas have consequences. I'm going to keep repeating that as long as I have to. So moving on then to the one that's probably the most often confused is reincarnation. Reincarnate, again, we're here in Arizona. We have a lot of affiliation with our Hispanic friends from the South. Speaking as the gringo in the room here, in carne or carne asada, that is referencing to meat. So that is a way to understand it. But the word literally in the Hindu language is, or Sanskrit literally, is to enter again. So not just enter into, but enter again into flesh, to not incarnate, but reincarnate. Now, when people say, in a past life, I was this or that or whatever, they usually assume that it was also a conscious human being, man or woman, but always of some royal status for some reason. And when they make these sort of claims, they are literally claiming the same odds, that in their previous lifetime, you would be winning the Powerball 15 times over compared to the last ounce and molecule of the universe, that their enduring self, their Atman, would enter into another human being, as opposed to this book, as opposed to this laptop, as opposed to that curtain fiber, as opposed to anything else in the universe that Hindus would also regard as containing that enduring self. The nature of the universe is Brahman. So when we're talking about, and Brahman, by the way, the creator, God in Hinduism, there's 33 million of them, but this
330 million.
Thank you.
330 million deities to choose from.
Well, you're attached to that number. You got to get past that. Anyway, just messing around. The idea of reincarnation, to enter into new flesh, from the Hindu worldview, sees that point, that Atman, you, in the rock or plant as much as a human being or an animal. And due to the not just impersonal nature of the religion, but also especially of the gods, makes it so that you're not coming back as a conscious human every lifetime, and that needs to be understood. There's various views as to what determines this in Hindu culture. There's different caste systems, there's different priest systems, there's different cultures and regions, and even times where they would determine these things differently. But the reason, say, for example, and we can empathize with this at least for consistency, why cows are pretty much the universal standard for as high as you get in the reincarnation cycle, is because cows, for all intents and purposes, they don't care about much. Bulls might, but the cow themselves, Bessie, she's just chilling out, eating, swallowing, regurgitating, doing her thing. And of course, when it comes to further studies of the trauma and brain activity that they experience when, say, for example, young calves are separated from their mothers, that's been a problem for Hindus, but they aren't attached to statistics and facts. The principle, although, is very important when they see the characteristics they're looking for in nature. That's the same kind of worldview that, say, biblical scholars are looking for when it comes to archaeological evidence that supports the events of the Bible. It's reinforcing their worldview and saying, that's what I hope to be. That's the kind of animal where he's just chilling. Doesn't care about, the animal. If he dies, but it's just not concerned. It's not attached to anything. And we see that the opposite is the case, especially for mother cows. But the point being made is important. When they regard these lives or use these as paragons, some would say, well, no, the panda's higher. Note for endangered species maybe is the statistic. You'd have to ask them.
Yeah, and keep in mind, we're attempting to provide definitions, but Hinduism is one of those worldviews that's nearly impossible to define because definitions of Hinduism are like noses. Every Hindu has one, and it'll differentiate. So all we're trying to do is highlight some of the common threads that are most common to most Hindu thinking. So the cardinal beliefs are the karma system, the caste system, and every birth is a rebirth. Every birth is a rebirth, which is the reincarnation idea, and then the Vedas.
And why we don't want that here, because we've seen the consequences of when that dominates a society.
Right, yep. And so as we go through these, keep in mind that if you have a Hindu friend, they most likely will say, well, no, that's not exactly right. And they're right, because the answer for a Hindu to any question is yes. Yes, all embracing. In fact, one of their gurus came to the West, I think it was in the 40s or 50s, Shankara, and described Hinduism in just one defining way and was like given a standing ovation. But later, I think the same guru said that Hinduism is all so embracing that once she squeezes, she will have embraced nothing and squeezed herself to death. Because if you just say, hey, do you think? The answer will always be yes, because you are not attached to any ideology. It's not monolithic. It's not a central, rigid view. It is yes, both this and that. We'll get into that more later.
Yeah, but just understand this point. When we're talking about reincarnation, they're playing a gamble of long odds and either misunderstanding or, dare I say, misrepresenting and as a result disrespecting this worldview. When they're claiming reincarnation, two things are assumed that we need to understand the Bible does not support. Universal pre-existence as opposed to post-existence, that I had a conscious life before this life, which the Bible does not claim. But also, and even more importantly, a system that is based on reincarnation not being a good thing, because in that attachment to return to flesh is not what you want. You want not to exist.
Yeah, you want to reach Brahman.
Yeah, you want to be a part of
or
the whole
moksha,
again.
Yeah, which is not necessarily heaven, but
enlightenment.
Yeah, and that this would be important real quick. When I try to explain Hinduism or even Buddhism, in contrast to the Judeo-Christian West, our understanding, you'll hear terms like monotheism. In Hindu Eastern thinking, you have a mixture of monism and pantheism and panentheism. The idea of monism is that the universe, all reality is one. So you won't find a monist or a Hindu praying per se. They meditate. Why? Because praying assumes an I-you relationship. I'm praying to you. But the whole idea of monism is that there is no I-you, there's only I, the great I. And not only is it, so there is no monotheism, it's just monism. And pantheism is the idea is that all this reality is divine. So the rats are divine, the cows are divine. And the goal is to deny oneself an attachment to this physical illusion. This reality is an illusion. This is not real. And to finally realize that, to enter into moksha, or becoming one with the great ocean. So the ocean, all reality is like an ocean, and every bubble is an existence. And if every birth is a rebirth, as you said, Westerners, when they hold on to these ideas, they all assume that of the billions of species of creatures on Earth, that you're going to come back as a human is sadly mistaken. So all of reality is eternal. All physical reality is eternal. It's an illusion, and it's divine. So pantheism means pan, all is God. Panentheism is that God is in everything. Those are fray views within, with most Hindus. But so if everything is divine, that's where you get the pantheism. So the idea, polytheism. So you can't even define it in that terms because they have 330 million deities, but they're all part of the same reality, the same divine reality. So even though it is pantheist, there is a polytheistic element different than the Greco-Roman polytheistic pantheon. So it's confusing because it is so undefined, because again, it's not monolithic.
Yeah, and like again we said, when you don't have that level of attachment to certainty or truth, it's not really a difference as to whether or not you're right, because it's just ultimately going to follow these cycles, these common ideas and themes. And that's why...
And any Hindu can find their way to moksha through either devotion, knowledge, morality. There is multiple paths to reaching, quote unquote, what a Westerner would refer to as enlightenment, where you actually keep throwing off attachment and you reach enlightenment. But it is not this is the way to salvation. Every way is the way. And if you come up with a new way, they'll say, yes, that's another way.
Until you get specific with them, and then you say, well, that's just your Western thinking, right?
And the reason they frown upon good deeds, like Mother Teresa, is because, wait a minute, you're interfering in the natural course of the reincarnative karma system. Not because this person is experiencing something bad, because they did something, quote-unquote, bad in their previous life. It's just the cycle. So if you're a wife abuser, you will come back as an abused wife. Not because abusing your wife is wrong, but because that is how karma system pays out. You're just paying out your karma through multiple, endless reincarnations, and you're trapped. Buddhism rejected this concept of being trapped and suggested the idea that, no, you could break free into nirvana, but that was, that's another subject for when we can cover Buddhism.
Dukkha and all that fun stuff. But the issue, again, with suffering is the solution is to stop caring. And when we see that fundamental difference in conflict, that even noting the perspective on wife beating, why is that a problem? Well, Sharia law would support it in Surah 434 of the Quran, when we note that, just justify it, right? Well, in Hinduism, they just redefine it, and noting just that's the way you exist. And to then reinforce the concept, it's not to condemn it, it's to say, this is how things are. Leave it alone. Because if you do anything, good or bad, that reflects attachment, and that is not good.
And you're interrupting that non-existent being's karma. You're interrupting, so that starving child, if I interfere, I am breaking their karma, and I'm actually going to make it worse for them than I am in my attempt at doing good.
Is anyone wondering why I don't want to read this anymore? So the point being made is this. Here are the main conflicts when it comes to Christianity and Hinduism, the common confusions that are made. The first and the most important is, again, thinking that divine judgment is karma, when in reality they couldn't be more unalike. Because the Christian belief of divine judgment is because a personal and conscious moral decision deserves, notice the ought there, punishment, that the bad produces bad, the evil produces evil, from a personal and conscious moral authority. Now, I'm being very intentional with my words, because notice the flip-flop. Hinduism has a system, not an entity, a system of indifference and attachment as the only good or evil. So the consequences are to achieve a balance, as we very difficultly tried to say, of an illusion. Take of that what you will. Whereas the wrath of God is acknowledging there is an actual difference between him and not him. His conscious will, nature, and attachments, as opposed to not his conscious will, natures, and attachments. The nobility of Hinduism and karma is confusing it with Christianity and justice. When you say, well, it's good then that wife beater is now a beat wife. Why? Because you think that there is a way someone ought to be treated and that wrath is due to them. But you're eliminating the whole assumption of Hindu thought, because it's not as if Brahman, Vishnu, Shiva, take your pick of the other 330 million. It's all centered around you shouldn't care about the first or the second life It's just the way things is. Leave it alone.
Yeah.
I didn't see nothing, right? There is no justice in karma. There's only indifference to another life regarding their suffering because you cared too much.
Yeah, because justice implies a objective moral ethic. Karma is not an objective moral. That's illusion. Okay, so when they say good and evil, they don't mean like a moral evil. They just simply mean a law of the universe, like gravity. If I drop this piece of paper, it's just going to fall. That's a law of the universe. It's not bad or good. It's just the way it is. And karma is like that. It's not a person judging because there is no moral ethic. So it's just the way things are. And I don't want to interfere by catching it because it's supposed to fall. It's supposed to just land, and that's it. And karma is that way.
It'll fall later.
Right. Yeah, and if you stop from falling now, i.e., feeding that starving child in a gutter, well, you've just caught karma, and now they're going to have to just come back through the cycle of many births and rebirths and pay it out eventually in this endless, eternal stream, inescapable stream of rebirths.
And not to belabor the point, but I think it bears rubbing into the dirt. Makes you wonder why they're so attached to the system of karma not working itself out. Why isn't our good deeds and efforts just a part of the way things are as well? Why isn't the interference a part of Brahman if it is in fact there? But understand, this isn't according to some cringy Christian pastor or some Western magician. It's according to Lord Krishna himself. Attachment is the issue. And if you don't regard that as your authority, well, then I hope that your guru has a longer beard. The point is that the second issue is resurrection versus reincarnation. When Christians are using the term resurrection, it's referring to that which died coming back to life. Notice that when Jesus, for example, said in the Gospel of John, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Notice the pronoun it, not I'll come back in another body. That you can't destroy me because life is an illusion. Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. What was destroyed, not what will ultimately come back through another cycle. And note as well, further explanation, well, he was describing it. No, speaking of the temple of his body. It was speaking of his physical nature, not your enduring self or soul, which are not the same thing, by the way. Entering into new flesh, Jesus is using himself as the model of resurrection. And another example would be when his body left the tomb. Notice, it didn't appear in a different body. The tomb was empty. Paul wrote about the Old Testament significance of this in light of Jesus' demonstration, like the Hindu sources would compare the Atman to a seed. This is 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 40. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown, notice seed to ground, a perishable body. It is raised an imperishable body. Now, is this a different body? Notice the consistency in pronouns once again. It is sown in dishonor. It, still singular, hasn't changed subject, is raised to glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So notice the point that he's making. Instead of just walking in circles about the whole concept and then just hoping his son stops asking questions, the non-statement that was made by the Father to the Son, Paul would explain instead that the seed and the tree are both the same thing substantively. Yet one is so much greater than it after it is quote-unquote died and is buried. It's not one seed but put into another seed because the part that you can't see is ultimately transferred. It's also the same mistake that people would make regarding Jesus' nature as God. When they say, well, Jesus existed before his physical birth, so why can't I? Hopefully saying that out loud has made you think that through. But in Micah 5:2 we note, and this is the only mention of this kind of concept, when Jesus is predicted to not only be the one born in Bethlehem, but that the one to be born's goings forth, his activities, were from old, from everlasting. Now, he is noticed, the one born in Bethlehem is singular. The Messiah is being noted as not only born in this location, but the only one in history that could claim this. We'll have time on other broadcasts to note how the mishandling say, for example, of when Jesus says that John the Baptist will come in the spirit and power of Elijah, but he then went on to explain in the same chapter, this is just to be brief, that Elijah proper is still coming. That the reason John the Baptist was identified as Elijah wasn't because he was reincarnated, he was a different person, but he would serve the same purpose as a forerunner to the Messiah. It was in job description, not an atman, not an identity. There's also an important point to note as well, that when, of course, something is very specifically noted about God, the classic anti-Semite internet troll is going to say, well, the Jewish sources and rabbis in the ancient world believed in reincarnation. You ask them where and when, and they either can't come up with an example or they hope that you don't look it up. It's ultimately having to misrepresent both sources in order to make them sound the same, which is both disrespectful towards Hinduism and Judaism and Christianity. We don't want to play that kind of game. So, with this then in mind, we have time for questions. Let me start with some of the more common ones just to be aware of, and we'll see what time we have left. If we don't get to your questions, we'll be happy to do so tomorrow. But the first and most common one is, as you mentioned before, Adrian, that when we say, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me, they would say yes. And you say, well, how then do you reconcile that with Jesus also being as equally valid as Islam, as well? I guess you could if you're a Roman Catholic now, but that's a moot point. When the argument is made, well, it's either or to you. We are Hindus. We believe both Jesus and Lord Krishna. Well, that sounds tolerant and inclusive, but what's the problem with that?
Well, they have to. Someone once said that, like trying to defeat Aristotle's law of non-contradiction, the idea that we talk about that a lot in the laws of logic here on the program, that two statements implying the same thing at the same place cannot elicit two opposite answers and both be true at the same time. The Eastern form of logic, and this always usually is explained by a Westerner, by the way. Yeah. So the idea of the Eastern form of logic is both this and that. Remember I said when you ask a question, the answer is yes? The idea is that in Eastern philosophy, there is no problem with contradictions. So if I say Jesus is the only way, yes. And if I at the same time say, and so is the guy I saw sitting on the side of the street in front of KFC in Bangalore, India, worshiping the snake that lived in the hole in the wall, was that a way to heaven? By their definition, yes. So they have no problem with contradiction. So the idea of either this or that is either this or that is concrete. It's exclusive. It's black and white. In Eastern philosophy, the idea, that, as it's said, is no, it's both this and that there is no problem with contradiction. The problem is that whenever you try to defeat the law of non-contradiction, you have to use it to defeat it. So if I say, no, we don't want to use a system of logic that is obeying the laws of logic and the law of non-contradiction. You guys believe in this or that. We believe in both and. And so the response is that, so you're telling me either I have to use the both and system of logic and not care about contradictions, or nothing else. And that's the problem, is in order to describe or even defeat the law of non-contradiction, you have to utilize it. It's as someone once said, it's like saying I cannot speak a word of English. I am affirming what I'm denying at the same time. So when they say, no, like one Brahmin professor told me, I've done 12 tours in India and spent a lot of time debating college students on college campuses. And this one professor, again, the same statement, the only way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to God but through me. She says, that is too concrete. That's the problem with you Western thinkers, is that it's too concrete. And I said, how do you get more concrete than I am the only way? Yeah, and it was such a struggle because she understood that by denying what I was saying, she was affirming what I was saying. She was affirming this or that. Contradiction, exclusivity, truth. And that becomes the bottom line, is that truth does not exist. Truth is an illusion within the Hindu religion or the Hindu philosophy. Truth does not exist. It's just yes, which is exactly what the enemy wants you to believe. Hath God said? It's the same kind of lie. You can be like God. You can be in control by denying everything or accepting everything. It doesn't matter and eventually you don't matter. It is such an ancient and deceptive philosophy, and yet it's so appealing to Westerners. But yeah, let's move on to the next question.
Yeah, and again, just so it's not missed, notice the issue.
Yeah.
Either the both and logic or nothing else.
Yeah, right.
So
and again, in order to affirm what they're denying, they have to implement or utilize. It's like when the atheist talks about how they don't like that there's evil in the world. Well, wait a minute.
Where are you getting
What do
that
you
from?
mean by evil? The existence of God is required as a foundation for morality and defining that which is good and bad. So when someone says, well, that's bad, wait a minute. You need God to say that, and that's the person you're denying, not affirming, so your question is nonsensical. It makes no sense at all.
And it doesn't mean that atheists can't be moral. They can reflect the image of God by accident, but the idea is whether or not they have grounding for it.
Yeah.
Another claim, and again, this is where you get down to the nitty-gritty, is that Jesus taught Hinduism in India. He was a guru, a respected teacher. But the problem with that claim, even of itself, is that a guru isn't just someone who teaches. It's whether or not they're teaching what we're both talking about. The substance of the message is what matters. So here's some of the teachings of Jesus. Let me know if this is Hindu. He's taught in Mark 12:29, referencing Deuteronomy 6:4, by the way, that there is only one God. Not 33 million.
That's either or.
330 million.
That's not both and, that's either or.
Yeah. He said that God loves us in John 3:16 and expressed it through a very attached action.
Love is a moral ethic and is therefore an illusion.
Uh-oh. He said that eternal life is knowing God, not becoming one with God in John 17:3.
Knowing something implies there is truth, and there is no such thing as true, therefore you cannot know anything.
Namaste. He said there is only one way to God in John 8:34 and 14:6.
We've already addressed that.
Yeah. And that evil is a real problem to be dealt with through him, not an illusion to be ignored in Luke 22:42. Let this cup pass from me, nevertheless not my will, but yours be done.
If Jesus taught Hinduism, he did not understand it at all.
Yeah, well, bad guru. They also would claim he's an avatar like Krishna. We'll maybe get more into this later, but that's not what an avatar is. Jesus and the Messiah and the avatar are two very different things.
Yeah.
But for the sake of time, feel free to leave questions if you'd like to know more about that. God bless you. We'll see you all again next time.
Yeah, take care.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.